Good morning, friends. Today we're going to be looking at slab building and how we can introduce it into creating our functional or our dysfunctional forms, or our dysfunctional teacups. So first we're going to start with our slab. So we can either make a slab by rolling it out with a rolling pin, a cup, or a soda can, or we can use it by repeatedly lifting and dropping it onto a flat surface. So now I'm going to go back to my sketch and I'm going to try and figure out which section I'm going to do first. So first I'm going to do the bottom section of the cup. So I need to take either the gift card that you guys received in your bags, a butter knife, or the back end of a fork in order to cut across a straight line. So I can also use some of the green tools in my kit in order to make a straight line. Right now I'm just going ahead and using the metal scraper, which is like your guys' credit card. So right now I have a shape that's pretty well flat. Now I'm taking it, I lifted it up, and I'm creating it into the arc surface for the base of my cup, because I want to have a semicircle in order to start with. But I had cracks in it, so I'm taking my sponge and I'm going through and I'm making sure I'm getting out all the cracks and I'm smoothing out the edges. I'm also adding moisture to it so that way when I bend it, it won't crack. So you can still see there were cracks in it, so that's because the clay was a little too dry when I was doing it. So we need to make sure we're monitoring our moisture levels when we're bending our clay in order to make sure that we aren't getting excess cracks, because this will cause problems later on down the line. So now I went ahead and I added the slab to a tape roll. You can add it to a tape roll, to a cup, but this will help maintain its shape as it goes through and dries. So we're working towards a leather harsh stage, and I'll explain that in a little bit, but I'm making sure it dries on top of that tape roll, and then I covered it in a damp paper towel. Now I'm making a second slab. So I'm doing this by using a rolling pin. Now I'm checking the thickness to see how close my thickness is to the one on my tape roll. So I'm going ahead and looking at it, and I can see that the slab I just rolled out is still a little thick. So I'm recovering the one that I had over the tape roll. I'm picking it up and dropping it in order to make sure it gets a little flatter. So I'm doing that technique instead of using the rolling pin, and that technique will be displayed in another video coming shortly. So now I'm slicing it, straight edges all along the sides. That way when I have a slab that I can build with, I'm building with something that is straight and rigid, and this way I won't get curvy edges, I won't get an imperfect bottom, I won't get a rigid top. So I want to make sure that all my sides are as close to possible. So you can do this by placing a ruler at it, or at the edge, and slicing on the other side of the ruler. So now I just checked to make sure my thicknesses were okay, and they seemed pretty close, but this one was still a little thick. So now I'm going through with my rolling pin, and I'm smoothing it out a little bit more because it wasn't quite there yet. So I always want to make sure that I'm checking the thickness over and over again to ensure that it dries all the same. So after I ensured that it was the same thickness, I went ahead and I took my scoring tool to make it into the size that I want. I want it straight on all sides. So now I'm trying to figure out how to best replicate the shape that I made with the first one. So using that tape roll again, I was able to get the shape. So now I'm going to slip and score the edges before I attach them. Think of it kind of like a puzzle piece. By making these indentations on the edges, I'm giving the puzzle piece a place to go on the other clay. So let's say the clay is the protruding end and the other piece is the receiving. I want to make sure that these pieces snap and connect well together. So I need to score the edges before I attach them. Then I'll take my green tool and I'll go ahead and I'll smear the clay from side to side. In another video, it'll go through a close-up of how you do this. So I want to make sure that I'm smoothing the clay into each other to create it as one clay body rather than two separate pieces. I also want to make sure that I'm keeping the piece moist as well. So I can do this by using a spray bottle on light mist setting and doing 1 or 2 sprays, or I can do it by keeping my sponge at the ready. So my sponge should be lightly damp, not wet, because otherwise I'll be adding too much moisture to the clay and the clay won't hold a shape. Instead, it'll just become a pile of mush. You'll also see at the top that I'm starting to get some cracks. I can also avoid this by 1, again, making sure it's moisturized, and then 2, continuing with the same technique that I'm giving on the sides. So smoothing out the clay over and over again, and really just working to manipulate the clay body. So once I smooth out the outside edges, I want to make sure I'm also smoothing the inside edges as well. So this way I have a cohesive piece on the outside, on the inside, and it helps maintain its form. And so also want to keep in mind while we're doing this, we also want to make sure that we're not making a thin spot. So as these pieces connect to each other and we're pulling clay from the outside edges, we also want to make sure that some spots aren't becoming thinner than others. So it's going to be a very gentle process, and you might have to repeat this process 2 or 3 times to ensure that you're getting the same thickness all the way around the pot. So when I was going through with this sponge, I'm also helping smooth out the cracks, smooth out the wrinkles, smooth out the indentations in my clay and the imperfections in my clay body. I want to make sure I do this while it's still soft before it gets too hard. Otherwise, it'll end up cracking as it dries, and in the kiln, it might crack and fall apart as well. So this is why we're making sure that the cracks are smoothed out and that the imperfections are minimal. So now I'm smoothing out the cracks and the crevices on the inside, just as I did with the outside. It's important to treat every surface of the clay, not just one or the other. So now I'm checking the outsides of the clay, and I'm seeing that there's cracks as well. And I'm also seeing in the bottom, we want to make sure that we're smoothing out those where it was scored together as well. So now I'm going to take my needle tools as well as my green tools and smooth out those bottom edges. I'm also going to be trimming off the top, because I want this to be one equal surface to where it's all flat on the top. So I'm using my green tool to score where it's going to be at. I can either use my green tool, I can use a needle if I have it, but I recommend using the green tool for this part, and then just doing repetitions of scoring over and over again on the outside and the inside until it comes off. So it's still not quite even, so I'm going to go ahead and take my scoring tool and keep working at it. Remember, it's always better to take off too little rather than too much, because it's harder to put back than it is to take off. So now I'm just treating the edges to make sure that the top is flat as well as the bottom. And I see those places where there's cracks. So I want to make sure that I'm smoothing and pulling and pushing clay to minimize or get rid of those cracks. And this is how I make one total cohesive piece. And then I go through with sponge again in order to make sure that it's all ready to go.